All right, so I am Nakatrice Perkins, Assistant Director of Social Equity. And today, as we look into the social equity series, we are unpacking our social equity lens. To do that, I want to just start with where we're going. So ODOT is on a journey, right? We have been doing the work the way we've been doing the work for as long as we've been here. And we are in a place now where we are pivoting the way we look at our work. We are pivoting how we move to better serve all Oregonians. We've always had a mission to serve all Oregonians, but unfortunately, like many institutions and systems, we've missed a lot of people. And so those who have been historically excluded, we're trying to make sure that they are included and that they also belong in the spaces that we are. Because of that, we're doing a number of things, all pointing to these places. In 2030, these things will be true about ODOT because we have prioritized diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the work we're doing now is getting us to this place. We want to make sure that ODOT follows policies, processes, and procedures to promote a diverse workforce. So there's people actively working on looking at our policies. Very specifically, we're asking the entirety of staff to look at how they do processes and procedures to make sure that people not only join our workforce, but are retained in our workforce. We want to make sure that ODOT has a strong partnership with businesses owned by Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women who have been historically and are currently marginalized or have been excluded from contracting because of systems that have been put in place that were not put in place by those who are here. When we say BIPOC, we also mean Asian Pacific Islander, Latina, Latino, Latinx, tribal nations, sovereign nations, Native Hawaiians. So we're not leaving people out in terms of their diverse racial or ethnic identity, but want to make sure that people understand what BIPOC is referring to when we talk about that. We're also looking at all ODOT projects and programs prioritizing social equity in their planning and risk assessments, that all voices of social identity or social demographics in communities that ODOT serves are heard and their viewpoints influence agency decisions. We've done a very good job of informing people about the work that we do throughout the state, and we want to continue that work. So we want to get to the point where we're not only involving them, but consulting them, and hopefully get to the point where we're collaborating with communities around our agency decisions and making sure that nobody's left out in that space. We want to make sure that our transportation investments benefit neighborhoods and communities that have experienced systematic harm in the past, right? So though these issues are systemic, they're also systematic. So over and over and over again, the same communities have been harmed by some of our transportation investments, and we want to shift that. And then finally, industry and program partners are held accountable to outcomes aligned with ODOT's commitment to social equity. So that means our consultants, our contractors, our partners, the people who we work with in terms of community-based organizations or CBOs, people who are asking to give us advice in terms of focus groups or information from some of the surveys that we send out. We want to make sure that they're also thinking about social equity. These are our impact statements, and we think these impact statements by 2030 will be true as we start pushing towards them, right? So we're right now in the spot where there's a number of things happening. There's a strategic action plan where we have 3 very clear implementing actions that the Office of Social Equity is working on in conjunction with a lot of different people. We've done a barriers analysis to best understand how we are not best informing BIPOC-owned businesses and how we can get them to be certified in some ways too, right? We know that's also a big gap, that being certified in one of our minority-owned business or women-owned business or veteran-owned business programs puts businesses in a place to easier work with ODOT. At the same time, it shouldn't have to be that. So how do we open up that space for more people, period? We're looking at our workforce, we're looking at hiring, we're looking at retention, we're looking at performance management, we're looking at promotion, and we're looking at belonging through the strategic action plan. And then we're also looking at engagement through the strategic action plan. So our team, small but mighty, is really working on these things to really push those things forward. At the same time, the Office of Social Equity is building the model, the office, the processes to get us here, right? Because these things, these 6 impact statements, will not be true in 2030, only focusing on the strategic action plan. So there are places where we can all be working towards a strategic action plan and also working to this, and that's going to take all of us. So why do we even have a plan of any sort, right? Why do we think about a social equity lens? We're starting with the lens because it is simply a way for us to change our mental models. it's not highlighted in this presentation, but when I first started at ODOT almost a year and a half ago, I talked about how this is going to be a transformative change. Us pivoting to a more equitable agency means that not only are we changing processes and policies, which is kind of the apex, right? That's the easy part. We're also changing relationships and what it means to have relationships with different people and who we let indoors and where we remove tape and where we remove barriers. It also means that we're going to have to think about things differently, not differently because we've been thinking about them wrong, but differently because we might have forgotten things over years, right? There's things that we haven't thought about. A social equity lens allows us to operate with urgency, transparency, and accountability. It gives us some things to immediately look at, to immediately tell other people we're looking at, and allow people to go, did you think about this? In that space, right? This is also one of the strategies that's coming out of the governor's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Action Plan. One of the strategies that ODOT is going to hone in on as we think about how we move forward. Social equity lens, it interrupts bias, right? It pivots longstanding institutional patterns. It informs resource allocation. It evaluates investments, and it guides decisions and actions. So what does that mean, right? We want to get to the point where we're asking, what's the decision? Who's being considered? What is making the decision? Like what really influences, we got to do this instead of that. How, right? How is that decision being made? Who is making that decision? What assumptions about the root of the problem do we have? So ODOT is a agency full of amazing problem solvers, right? I have not met anyone yet that is not on their toes quickly to take off on a problem, right? And really make sure it's something that we take care of. In that space, all of us make assumptions about why a problem is what it is. And unfortunately, many systems treat the symptom of a problem and not necessarily the root. Social equity lens asks us, like, what are the assumptions about the root of the problem? How did it get here? And what do we just automatically think, oh, it must be this? Where can we interrupt that? It allows us to ask what data or info is available and being used. Because sometimes we have some info and data that we're not using. And sometimes we have info and data that we prioritize over others. And sometimes it's just saying what that is. It also asks us what is the benefit and burden distribution. What's important about a social equity lens is that when you go through and ask these questions about any project, any policy, any process, you're not always going to get affirmative answers like, yes, I'm doing it. Yes, I'm doing that too. Of course I did that. Absolutely, I did that. Sometimes you're going to get a, no, I did not think about that. And in this moment, you might not be able to pivot, but that does mean it's a moment for you to think about how you pivot next time or how a process or procedure could be changed to make that pivot. That's really important. As I've started to talk to people about the social equity lens and gone through things, whether it's the cost estimating tool or some DMV products and programs, the question is like, well, we're not doing it. So now what? So we're not doing it. And so how could we do it, right? That is really where the work happens. And this work is all of ours. I'll talk at the very end about the things that are coming next to give as many resources and tools and how the Office of Social Equity is really moving into a place of thought partnering and accountability partners so that we really can hone in very specifically for different seats and how they're moving. But this really is a tool to let everybody start the process because it's urgent, right? We're not going to get to 2030 unless all of us start to think about this. So this is our social equity lens. Only has 4 questions. How have or will historically excluded communities be informed, consulted, or involved? What methods or tools were used for this engagement? And to be specific. This question is not something that automatically pops up somewhere for people. It's not that we're going to always collect the data. Now, I will say right now, as people are doing scoping, finishing that process, these are questions that they are being asked, and it will allow us to think about and see how we're thinking about things. At the same time, we don't have to wait for that, for you to be using these questions. You're not having to wait for it to pop up in your process. This is a moment where how can you put these things in your process, right? So, and in this space, what methods are being tools? You might say, how have they been informed, consulted, and involved? They haven't. You sent out a mailing, and so I hope everybody got it, right? What methods or tools are being used for this engagement? Be specific. We sent out a mailing, and we hope everybody got it. That might be your answer now, which then leads you to other questions, right? It gets into the slide before that asks us to get into it. How does that inform your decision? Who is excluded from this? Why did we do it that way? What assumptions are made in that space? So for that one, the assumption is that everybody checks their mail. People see ODOT Department of Transportation logo and they're like, oh, let me make sure I read this. There's things like that that we can think about. For each question, it can easily be broken down and have 10, 15 sub-questions from it. These are our 4 high-level questions. So you start here. You might also just start with one question. It's not that did I ask every single one and everything I'm doing, but the thought is that when you're sitting at your desk, when you're sitting in your truck, when you're at your counter, when you're on the phone call with a customer, when you're in those spaces, which one of these things can you kind of put into your mind? I recently gave somebody an idea to like put a post-it that just says like, how did I think about equity today, right? So we can start getting into the habit. That's how we're going to pivot. And this is a way to start that process. Second question, in what ways does this address needs expressed by historically excluded communities? What are the benefits and burdens to those communities? We really are focusing on historically excluded communities because if we figure out how to include and ensure that communities that have experienced disparity and barrier, if they're a part of our solutions, everybody's being served, right? Oftentimes we think about, as long as we do the most good for the most amount of people, we're good. That has gotten us to a place where there's communities, again, systematically excluded based on their identity. And so we want to shift that. But this does not leave out people who are currently experiencing benefits. It puts us in a place where we're trying to make sure that one community is not experiencing all of the burdens. Does this affect the high social equity index area? And I'll go over that in 1 second. If so, is there an opportunity to address economic or health disparities this community experiences? I ask that because ODOT is not doing this by ourselves, right? So the state of Oregon put out a diversity, equity, and inclusion action plan, and many other agencies are doing the same things to include our MPOs, to include the cities, counties, and that we work in, the districts that we work in. A lot of people and a lot of entities are trying to figure this out. I say that because some of our investment impacts are not just because ODOT did this. ODOT did this and it made room for this, and then this happened, and then that happened. ODOT made a decision that wasn't necessarily a bad decision. However, it had some climate effects and some health disparities. And so can we get assistance on that? Some of this is really about how we create partnerships and tap into other state agencies or local agencies around making sure that health disparities or economic disparities, which are two, thinking about our climate and thinking about our mission, climate goals and our mission that are central to who ODOT is and what we're trying to do. And then finally, is there an opportunity in your work to increase safety, which is all about who ODOT is, or access, which is all about who ODOT is, to historically exclude access for excluded communities that does not directly address the purpose of the project? If so, what is the cost or risk to ODOT, and how do we mitigate that cost or risk? This question is a big and important question because something else that is very clear, and again, I haven't talked to everybody in the agency. I'm trying really hard to get there, but the things that we do, adding equity, prioritizing equity, focusing on equity means that it shifts the scope of a project. It shifts the scope of a program. It shifts the scope of everything we're doing. What that also means is that it shifts the timeline and it shifts the budget. What that also means is that there's some things that we simply cannot do. So you ask this question and you're like, well, yeah, we could do X, Y, and Z that would increase the safety or access to a historically excluded community. That would shift my budget and timeline. If we had this, I would be able to do that. That information is the information we need to get the resources to do some of the things we're doing. So I want to put a little bit of emphasis on using this, right? Like, how are you asking? When are you talking about it? How is it being resourced? And also emphasis on, we're not always going to get these amazing positive answers that is like, yes, we did it all. Some of it is like, we can't, this is what we could be doing that will make a huge difference that we can't do because of time or budget, because of resource in terms of people on my team. That is very real. And we need to know that. And right now we don't, right? Because we do things very specifically on projects and programs. And so we're figuring that out, which is another reason why we are asking people to use the social equity index. I want to talk a second about exclusion, concern, and vulnerability. So in this space, you'll see that on most things that come out of the Office of Social Equity say historically excluded communities. You'll also see things sometimes from our documents that say communities of concern. You'll see things that say vulnerable communities. I want to point out that in many cases, this means the same group of people. Office of Social Equity continues to talk about historically excluded communities because we're talking about communities, we're talking about it from the context of we need to remove barriers for people. The barrier was excluding them from something, right? They didn't have access to something, their voice wasn't used for something. So they are literally, have been and are being excluded. In that space, there's also concern. So for some context, it's like we have a concern that for my project, there is not a safe walkway for this community. It is a community of concern, very specific. You just say which community it is. It might be all the communities we're talk about historical exclusion, but it might be the disability community in Southwest Bend. That could be the community of concern. We talk about vulnerable populations, there's context there. Vulnerable to what, right? And so communities are not necessarily vulnerable to barrier or vulnerable to systems. Systems have excluded them, systems have created barriers, which is why we use that language. But you might be vulnerable to climate disparity. You might be vulnerable to economic disparity or education disparity. And some of our investments can have an impact on those. So when you're talking about communities that are vulnerable or vulnerable communities, you still might be talking about, again, everybody who we are speaking to in terms of historically excluded communities, or you might mean a very specific community. You might mean children whose first language is Spanish in NISA, right? Which is far, far east in Oregon. That might be the most vulnerable community. We're talking about specific road and access. So that is why you'll see different language in different spaces. And it doesn't make any of it wrong. The historically excluded community is our largest bucket at ODOT, and we're talking about the communities that we're trying to make sure are part of our decision making. So it's also been a systemically discriminated against or excluded from transportation planning and decision making. Specifically, we're talking about people living with disabilities, people over the age of 65, people living in poverty, people with limited English proficiency, people who identify as BIPOC, and again, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which also includes Latina, Latino, Latinx, tribal nations, Asian, Asian Pacific Islander, Native Alaskan. We're talking about these specific identities because we know, research knows, there's so much information, which I'll point to places where you can see that as well on our intranet, that the intersection of these, them standing on their own, these groups of people experience exclusion more than others. When you look at this group in terms of exclusion, systems have excluded them. Systems have not made sure their voices at the table. Systems have not seen them as part of, if we do the majority, do the best for the majority, all will be well. Oftentimes, we're not thinking about this group, even if they are the majority in a space, right? Even if they are a majority in the neighborhood, even if they are a majority in a region or a part of the state, and for sure not the country. Right. So when we think about people in that way, we've often excluded these from a systemic way. And so that's why we use these 5. In other spaces, like we're talking about active transportation, for instance, it also makes sense to think about people without cars. It makes sense to think about young people. We're talking about safe routes to school. So it's not that these are the only people we're talking about. When we talk about historically excluded communities, for us, we're focusing in this space, and it's how we've created the index, because we can layer all those other things on top of it and know that there's more disparity or there's more barriers. But at the very base, we know that these people, regardless of where they live, rural, metropolitan, suburban, big city, small city, medium city, they're experiencing disparities. So that's what we're talking about. When we talk about engaging with these communities, it means obtaining and utilizing the feedback in terms of analysis, alternatives, decisions, right? That's what consulting them would look like. Or working with the community throughout the project to ensure that their desires are or concerns are understood and addressed. And that's what involving them would look like. And that is why we're working on an engagement toolkit to help us figure out how to better consult and involve, because we do such a good job of informing. So I wanted to also dig into a question a little bit. And I'm trying to go a little bit faster so that I can give us space to talk and people to ask questions, right? So every time you're asking a question, the social equity lens was designed for us to assess, examine data, engage and plan, implement and measure success. That is the goal of those 4 questions. When you're breaking them down, which you can do as in any way you want to, and also a social equity blueprint will come out next month. to give you some more ideas of ways you can ask more questions. But in breaking it down, so we broke down in what ways does this address the needs expressed by historically excluded communities? What are the benefits and burdens to those communities? We're asking, maybe we're breaking down, what are the barriers, right? What are the barriers that get us to fair outcomes? Oh, there's a whole phrase missing there. What are the barriers that get us to fair outcomes for historically excluded populations? Fair outcomes being the end of the project, being the end of the program, being our goals, right? Equity is input and outcomes is equality. So what are the outcomes we're looking for? What can we shift to make sure that outcomes, that everybody has access to the same outcomes? What data sources will we use to understand the impacts of race, ethnicity, ability, income, and native language, and age? And how will we modify or enhance our strategies to ensure the needs of historically excluded populations are addressed? How will you shift the planner process? What is the challenge? What is possible immediately? Does this success measure properly evaluate the success relative to the historically excluded community, right? So we're looking at ways to think about evaluating it, and does the measure that we're using really evaluate the needs from that community? So there's different ways to break down each question. I'm going through this because I want to be sure that people don't, this is a frame, a sideboard, right? There's like boundaries instead of this is exactly what you need to do and how you need to do it. Because equity simply does not work that way, and it won't. We're not going to have a checklist. We're going to have guides, we're going to have toolkits, and we're going to have people to help all of us together figure out exactly what it looks like in all of these spaces, which again, I'll talk about a little bit in a second. So this is a way to do that for just one question based on thinking about one specific project. The last thing I want to talk about is the social equity index, which I just talked about a little bit in terms of the pieces that were used. So we use the American Community Survey Black groups to understand vulnerability and therefore impact on cross sections of Oregonians that experience investments in decisions, which is every Oregonian, right? So this map thinks about, again, age, ability, race, ethnicity, language, and income, right? Over the amount of people in a Black group to create an index. The low or the light blue is 0.3 to 0.7, which shows that is the smallest amount of social equity disparity that we'll see. High, which is the darkest of blue, is the highest social equity disparity. But I do want to go to the map for a second, if it'll let me. Thinking. And I'm going to ask, so I can see their face. Angela, can you see the map, Angela Miller? No? Okay. So let me stop sharing and reshare. Oh, my computer's telling me I'm doing too much. It's pausing. It's frozen.
I can see the map now, Nikatris.
But now the map is, now my computer is frozen. Okay. Okay, can you all see me moving the map? Is this the map you can see? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is the statewide equity map. I want to go through some of the layers and ask if there's layers that you think would be helpful. So right now we have, and we're switching some of these things. We have just without anything, just low, medium, and high, low, medium, high, and high, just so you can see the spaces. You can also see these in delivery and operation regions. Oh, my computer's going so slow. Right, so those are those red lines. You also can see them based on DMV regions. So the purple lines, and Portland, there's a region in here that is easier to make it bigger. So you can see that the small and dense region in Portland. You also can see it based on the 21-24 STIP lines and the points, right? And so, and we're
Nikatris, sorry to interrupt. We are seeing your static slide and not the active application. So I don't know if you want to try and stop share, reshare again.
Stop share, reshare. I did a whole little situation. You all didn't even see it. I was clicking all the buttons. Thank you. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you one more slide, and then I'm going to come back to the map. So I'm going to show you the map in 1 second. So I'm going to do instead, I'm going to tell you next steps. Then I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'll go through the map as well. So the next steps, one, we were waiting for the diversity, equity, and inclusion action plan, which I hope you all have seen, to put out a social equity blueprint. Our office is also part of working on the enterprise-wide action plan, things that will make sense for all agencies across the board. Now we're finalizing the blueprint to align with that, taking into consideration all that we know about ODOT as well, the projects we're working on, the places that we're running into issues. And by issues, I mean like hardships in making this work for us, right? Like how OHA does it is going to be different than how ODOT does it. Not because we're not all focused on equity, but because our work is different. And so we'll be focusing on strategies 3 through 10 from the action plan, and we'll lay out what that looks like. Also working on training resources. So Social Equity Foundation, there's a complete curriculum, there's a glossary, there's Under 5, which is a series of 10 under 5-minute videos or under for people to watch. We're also working on some training resources around the equitable compensation plan and performance management, and why it's important to think about that from an equity space. We're also figuring out how to think about culture, accountability, and diversity from our workforce partners and advisors. So something that I think about all the time is like culture eats strategy for road trip snacks, right? So we can create all the strategies in the world and have all of the plans and goals, but unless we shift culture and the conversations we have and how we hold people accountable and who's at the table, it doesn't shift. And so we need to think about that not only agency-wide, but across our partners and teams as well. So creating more spaces that we're talking to them about what this looks like, what ODOT's doing, and why. Some of that is going to be led by us in terms of we found out exactly who we're talking to. Some of that we're asking you to help us figure out, right? Like, who do we need to talk to about this? We want to be your thought partners and accountability partners. If I'm asking like, so how's the social equity lens going? You're like, it's not. How can we help it go, right? What team can we come and talk to? What project can we really apply it to and try it? And this also is happening in using and thinking about our social equity partners who are currently working on opportunities to embed social equity in apart from their seat, right? So that means there's somebody thinking about every single day, I call people about doing an audit, right? We're about to do an audit on your business and we need to collect the following information. How can that process think about equity? So the social equity partner thinking about that and what success will look like. So they're currently creating those statements and success. And then finally, strategic recommendations. And so how can you use the tools and resources, which I kind of just talked about, into your social equity, into your team processes. October is the month where we are shifting our intranet website from wherever it lives now to SharePoint. And SharePoint has so much more information. So we're really building it out. So stuff that you don't see on the intranet now will be on the intranet within just a short week. So much more information. And through the month of October, really rolling things out and creating space for people to ask questions about how they use stuff and what things look like. What else do you need for about a second? Because then we're going to shift to how can we help you use what already exists, right? The things we've created have been based on feedback, have been based on, well, we need this, we need it to be shorter, we need it to be easier to use. And so we're creating all of those things, or have created most of those things already, to ensure that it's available to you. I see one question in the chat, but I'm going to stop sharing because my computer is kind of frozen a little bit, or all the way frozen actually. So I can't see anything. Can somebody tell me what they can see right now?
Nakatris, I can see the next steps. So the social equity blueprint, training resources, workforce partners and advisors, and strategic recommendations.
So yeah, my computer is all the way, Zoom is frozen, which I would like to say, I always get on Teams case, and today I'm on Zoom's case. I I have no idea how to fix it. Any Zoom professionals out there? I think I have to log out and come back in. And I don't even know how I'm gonna do that.
Nicatus, you can make me the
I
controller.
can't make anybody anything because my computer is. So I'm going to ask, can somebody read the question for me in the chat?
I just made the suggestion that we could explore the link independently while you walk us through it, if you wanted to show us or explain the map that way.
We could explore the link independently. Oh, yeah. If I could just get the link going.
Nikatra, someone went ahead and dropped the link in the chat.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. So I can talk through, if you have the link in the chat, the link has, the map has multiple layers to it. The lightest, I'm glad I explained the map when we were looking at the static picture. So the lightest blue are where we see the least amount of intersection of those populations and therefore disparity. And then the darkest blue is where we see the highest concentration of historically excluded communities, and then therefore the most disparity, right? And so, and you can take the layers on and off. We're adding more layers pretty consistently. Right now, you see a D and O, delivery operations lines that are a light red. You can add the DMV lines. You can see them in purple. You can see the 21-24 STIP. See safe routes to school as well. And if there's other things that will be helpful to add it, please let us know. The point of this map being in this application is that not only can we use it, which I know that it's also in TransGIS as people are doing planning and scoping, because it's more helpful in that space for people. But we're leaving it here and also adding or doing another map that's a story map to help us understand who specifically lives in history of many of the places throughout the state, because we want it to not only be a tool for us to see our projects, but also for the public to see our projects and how we're moving and where we are, and what communities should be included, and things that we might not have known or thought about when we think about our programs, the areas we want to serve. It gives us a chance to look at all of those things. So,
recording in progress.
Oh, that didn't work. I just changed to my computer. So, yes. Are there other questions, thoughts? Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is so interesting. Holding the phone, having conversation. All right, so you can hear me. Same letters, just a different interface. Yeah. So, are there other questions people have about or anything I said, the social equity lens, or what's coming next, or any of those things? I want to be mindful of time too. We have about 20 minutes. We will try to end them on time. Or there's something else you want me to do a deeper dive into, please let me know and I can do that as well. Nothing, everything makes perfect sense. Everybody's a deeper dive into upcoming blueprint. Yes, absolutely. So someone asked for a deeper dive into the upcoming blueprint. Yes, you definitely can have that. So in the upcoming blueprint, what it will explain is kind of all of the things that, like, why we're doing equity, which started in 2016 under the last director, why we're doing it, where we are, and then also how you can connect strategy, right? So our impact statements, again, are the high level of where we're going. By 2030, that's where we're going to get. As we get there, what can you use? One, the social equity lens is the best entry point in terms of starting to think about social equity. And also using that social equity lens should help you connect to very specific strategies, which will be to foster inclusive communications. We're going to strengthen our community engagement. We're going to utilize disaggregated data as a lever for change, create equitable budget and inclusive budget processes, advance contract equity and improve our procurement process, build a more diverse workforce and create an inclusive workforce, really think about what it means to have no tolerance for racism, hate, and discrimination. And we're doing all of that with the operation and urgency, transparency, and accountability, which is using the social equity lens, right? And so this really is introducing the first piece to it. We already have introduced it. And then going to those other strategies, the blueprint will go through actions. What could you do in this space? This is why this is a thing. This is how we're already doing it in spaces. And these are ways you could think about it. And then questions to ask yourself to really hone in on how you do it. The goal for the blueprint is really to give us a more narrowly tailored idea about how we interact with social equity, why it's important, and what you can do from every seat, right? Like, we have to be doing this from 4,700 spots for us to pivot an agency and say that we prioritize equity. Like, the creation of these documents doesn't prioritize it. Talking about it won't prioritize it. The outcomes we see in the next few years is what prioritizes it, and the blueprints to help as many people as possible see that. So in addition to the blueprint, we'll try to create a one-pager as well as something that's really short to connect you to the blueprint if reading it, going through it is not something that makes sense for your job duties. And then being available to, like, if a team is like, I need you to come talk to the maintenance crew about the blueprint, and we want to hone in on what it looks like to create inclusive communications. And so really thinking about that and making that a space. I also see a question. So the social equity lens, can you talk more about the index? And should we be focused more on economic or health disparities, or is there more? Okay, so the social equity lens are the 4 questions, right? The social equity lens asks 4 specific questions. The social equity index is a way to use some of those questions, because when I ask you, how does this affect historically excluded communities? When you go look at the map, you're like, oh, there's a historically excluded community right here in my project. And so I want to make sure that this is what we're doing, right? This is a community that we're in. And so you use both of them, really, but the questions is how you enter the conversation. The index allows us to think about communities that we haven't thought about and be very clear about where they are and how they're experiencing ODOT. And then should we be focused more on economic or health disparities, or is there more? So we really are thinking about transportation, right? When we ask about economic and health disparities, it's thinking about how some of our projects create those. When our projects displace people, it creates economic and health disparities. And so how can we think about that on the front end and create a partnership, create a conversation to make sure that those things are being thought about as part of our project? Some of our projects displace people. Some of our projects change neighborhoods in a way that gentrifies them. Some of our projects change neighborhoods in a way that makes not having a car or relying solely on pedestrian movement as my sole means of transportation. relying on that, and our project doesn't make space for that. So that creates economic and health disparities. Sometimes our project creates health disparities just based on how long trucks, what trucks, the type of materials that we're using are in an atmosphere, what kind of traffic will be there. And so some of these go hand in hand also in talking to the climate office, right? As you think about putting the climate action plan into motion, you think about all the ways you can lower GHG levels in a space. Doing that in that space means that you have thought about also some health disparities. Are there more disparities? Absolutely. We talk about education, food, but I think if we think about economic and health, those two are most tied to our work, because our mission talks about the economic health of the economic thriving, right, of Oregon. So that means of people. And health, we're really thinking about climate justice and climate equity. So those two are already kind of built into the things that we're trying to work on at this moment. What is the mechanism for holding ODOT accountable? You provide the questions and directions. How do we ensure the questions are asked and the direction is followed? So we are working on the accountability spaces. Right now, the accountability is Office of Social Equity, right? So asking every single, like, how are you using this? How does this work? I'm asking everybody to use it, because the other thing that's really important in this is that we have buy-in, we have participation. And so, because what that'll do is as we create the accountability measures, whether that's project scoring for our diverse workforce, is thinking about the choice index, which will help us measure what it looks like for recruitment, hiring, retention, promotion, and belonging. Those things are not activated yet, right? But as they become activated, they should be informed by, like, hey, we didn't think of, I asked these questions and this part's wasn't included, that we didn't think about this right here. So we're on the precipice, right on that line of using this now allows there to be shifts, to be thought, to be input on what some of those accountability measures look like. So for the workforce, for instance, we're waiting for the belonging survey to come out in January, but as we build hiring processes, as we build recruitment processes, we're shifting that stuff now. So when the belonging survey comes out, we have an index, and now we're moving, and you can see the index for us being a workplace of choice. As people are starting to scope or doing the scoping process, the cost estimating tool, we'll pull Office of Social Equity, we'll pull all that data, and we'll see, this is where we do well, this is where we don't. And this is now what the direction, the accountability, and what's required as we move forward to get us towards our impact statements. We're also starting to work on project and program scoring so that we can look at the attributes of our projects and programs and really decide what would mean that we have prioritized equity. But by you using the social equity lens as an introduction to that, there's information you can provide so that it informs that final step of accountability long-term. Hoping you can add a document on your webpage that has the 4 social, yes, it's on the new page. Just give us 1 second, please. Yes, just give us 1 second. Yes, we are building, and by we, it was me, but now it's not me. So I got some help to help build it, and they're on vacation. And as soon as they come back, which will be the end of this week, we will have it up and running in the new SharePoint site. That the same link will be the same, but all of this will be there for people to use. Is the training going to cover, once you identify disparity, how you go about reaching out to the particular group? So this training won't cover that. However, the training that will cover that is thinking about how to use the engagement toolkit, right? So something else that's being added to the site are 2 things. 1, the engagement toolkit, which allows us to think about how you engage communities that have been excluded, how you involve them, and how you involve them and how you consult them throughout the state, right? Very specifically. So there'll be there's a step-by-step, if you do this and you did that, if you didn't talk to this person, you do that. So it'll give you an if-when space so you can really click through it. That'll be on the website as it rolls out. And then the second thing is a list of community-based organizations, one that people are already using throughout the state and some that people aren't. So you'll be able to see this organization really serves this group of people in the following counties. And this is where you can connect with them, right? So we're connecting, like we're really trying to really focus on what it looks like to engage with communities that have not been engaged with in the past. And so creating that space so you don't have to look or find them for yourself, that they're already there for you. And I would be interested. I'll be interested to see how the Office of Social Equity is pulling the data from the CETs. Also, as it helpful at the lower levels to know more of the details of how their work environment, requirements, general operations of their daily work will change as a result of these changes, assuming that this will be provided within the guidance on the website. So yes, how we're changing, how we're pulling the information, because of this spreadsheet, it's literally going to be by hand. And so it's like, it was get the information in or don't. And our office right now is 3 people. We're building it, and hopefully we'll have 2 more people very soon. And in doing that, it's us mining through the data. A lot of the data that we're going through is hand, right? It's like me reading through what every comment somebody said, adding it into an Excel spreadsheet, creating a data way to mine it, and doing the analysis myself. And so that is actually how it will be collected from the CETs. And in terms of everybody knowing more details about how this could reflect or result in changes, 2 things. One, yes, things will be provided on the website. In terms of guidance on the website, the way this would affect your day-to-day, it could affect literally how you go about your processes. And also, you have input on that. So the thought is, if someone says, Nakatress, when you think about, how are you thinking about equity in your role, that I could tell you exactly how I think about equity, no matter where I worked in the agency. This is how I think about equity. That's a shift that some people might not have to change, because if you ask them now, they can tell you. Some people haven't thought about these things. And so the shift is that. The shift is that will change. Some of the other things that will change are in applying an equity lens to how we hire, our interview panels, our development plans. They'll just be available to more people. The interview panel will be trained differently. We'll make sure HR is on the interview panel. Like, some of those things will shift. And so we think about development plans. How do we make sure that somebody comes into the agency also has access to start to grow immediately? Can they try a machine that they have not tried before or not experienced on? Can they sit in a meeting and understand how the larger strategic process is working for a department or a team or a crew that usually they wouldn't, because that's not where they sit? But how do we make sure that that's available to people? So we'll see changes like that by applying an equity lens to our processes. In terms of policies, there'll be maybe some language that changes, but those things will become, the goal is for it to be second nature, right? So the changes should come like, oh, this language changed in the policy. Oh, we do this in our meetings now. Oh, don't forget the interview panel needs to look like this. And there'll be trainings and guidance that rolls out every time one of those shifts happens. Will the link and more information on the social equity index map be posted on the social equity? Yes, it will. It's on the new page. And I apologize that it's not on both. And I know that you all do the same thing. So like, when you have an office, you run the website, right? So like, I run the website. And so then I got some help and from communications to like help build a new one. And so now that's what they're doing. And I'm not adding all the things to the website. So the website is not good, our current one that you see. But if you just give us 1 week, next Friday, right, it's October 1st, the website will be there, and I'll do a News Hub video situation to explain like all the things that are there, what you need, how you click, what to go through so you don't miss anything. It's full of a lot of information. And so yes, it'll be added to that. And I did not personally add it to the one that we have now. It's 11:54. So I think that's all the questions people have. If anybody else has another question, or if I didn't answer anything completely, please let me know. I would love to do that. If not, or while you're thinking, I would like to say thank you very much for coming to another installment of the Social Equity series, and also invite you to our next one, which I can't tell you today because my computer's frozen, but it is on the News Hub. And that one is on the old page, so you can see that as well. The next one is gonna have guests. It's our first one with guests, which is very amazing, to talk about tribes and our relationship with tribes and how we can better be partners with our tribal, better relationships with our tribal partners. And so we'll have guests, and it's a little bit longer. It's an hour and a half. So if you look on the News Hub, it's there. It's in October. And if you look on our current social equity, Office of Social Equity intranet, it's on there too with it's the same link. You can just save it, but the date's there and the time's there. And so hopefully you'll join us for that too, or play it in your background or go watch the recording. So I will make sure that this is uploaded by the end of the week to our website. The old one, it'll automatically be migrated to the new one, but I'll make sure it's loaded to the old one so you have this recording. And yes, thank you very, very much for coming. If you have any other questions that you think of, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. You can email me directly. Thank you very much, Lisa, for putting inside the chat right now, the information for the tribal relations one is in there. If you have any other questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, Perkins, at all the great things that comes after that, or you can email the Office of Social Equity at socialequity@ODOT and all the great things that come after that. If you ever have more questions or want us to be somewhere to dig any deeper to make sure that you get everything you need as we pivot. So yes, thank you very, very much. I hope you have an amazing Wednesday.
Thanks, Nikatris.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too.
Okay.